There we go. I'm Mike Kershaw. I do a bunch of Wi-Fi and packet-related stuff. So I do Kismet, if anyone has ever played with that. I do a bunch of other radio stuff. Currently, I work for Hack5, so we make a bunch of neat radio and other tools like that. We're going to talk about, when is a packet not really a traditional packet? So it's a huge topic, but we're going to try to do our best in an hour. When you'd use an SDR and why you might want to pick that hardware. Some basic SDR concepts. We'll try to dig into some real examples of tricks for decoding. It gets a bit dense, but hopefully it's enough to start a bit of a journey, inspire people on what to look up and research more, and kind of work from there. So normally, just let people sit down for a moment. Yes, thank you. So normally, packets will come in from a network interface, E0, WLAN0, whatever, everyone should be, probably familiar with that at this point. So you have a dedicated network interface for your Ethernet, for Bluetooth, for Wi-Fi. Even monitor mode comes in, it's just over Wi-Fi. It's got special radio headers on it, but it's still just coming in as a packet to the network or to the kernel. So you use PCAP, you use Wireshark, and you're great. But what else is out there in the air? Aliens, I don't know. But also, power meters. Most modern power meters now have either unidirectional, where they just broadcast the meter usage, so the cars can read them from the street, or bidirectional, where you can actually communicate with the power meter to implement, power saving techniques during heat waves and whatnot. Airplanes all beacon where they are, what airplane they are, things like that. Home weather stations, all the ones that have the little display that goes inside your home, have talk over basic wireless, and you can use that to monitor them. A lot of consumer light switches, the ones that aren't more advanced using Zigbee or something, the little RF ones that you buy, you can monitor them. Tire pressure monitors, tons of random IoT devices that have an adapter that plugs into your network, and then the sensor that goes out somewhere in your house are all also using random radio protocols, and you can actually start looking into them. So standard hardware, like network interfaces and whatnot, are fixed frequency radios. So they listen to a certain frequency. So Wi-Fi is on 2.4 gig. They listen to 2.4 gig. They don't really listen to anything else. All the demodulation, the decode, the radio work is done in the hardware for you. So when the radio gets a packet, it does all the demodulation and then says to the operating system, here's a packet. So the operating system only has to wake up, receive the packet, and it doesn't have to do anything more with the lower layers. They're completely useless at being anything else. You're not going to sniff Bluetooth with your Wi-Fi card. You're not going to see, your power meter with a Bluetooth device, because it's all hard-coded into the chip design to only handle that one protocol. So software-defined radios, on the other hand, are usually multi-frequency receivers. They're very wideband, so you could see, everything from FM radio to 5 gig Wi-Fi with a single device. So they're made up of the radio front end, an analog to digital converter to take the radio signal and give it into some form of digital. Sometimes you'll have additional accelerators, so they might have an FPGA on them. They might have an ARM processor or something to help with the processing load before it sends it to the computer. They have no idea what a packet is. They have no idea what anything is. It is sending a 100% bandwidth stream 100% of the time to the computer, and it's up to you to figure out what to do with this huge pile of data. So they're kind of like a Swiss Army knife. So if the SDR can basically do anything, why don't we do everything with SDR? Like, why do we have dedicated cards? Have you ever tried to eat a meal with a Swiss Army knife? So on the plus side, in SDR, you can discover new protocols and new devices that you haven't seen before. Some new random consumer light switch controller or something. You can capture, effectively infinite protocols with a single device, because you can write whatever demodulation and decoder for the protocol you want. You can capture signals where there's no commercial hardware. Like, you can't go and buy a network card that captures weather stations, but you can go buy an SDR and do that. And you can manipulate protocols in a way dedicated hardware can't. So if you're doing, more advanced stuff where you're transmitting, you can create packets that like Wi-Fi firmware wouldn't let you create because they're not really valid, but you want to send it anyway. You can do that with something like an SDR. On the downside, they can be expensive. The cheapest ones are $20 to $30. The most expensive ones are $20,000 to $30,000 or more. They require a lot of power in just terms of electrical energy. You're not going to have a great time running an SDR off a battery for a long time because they don't know what a packet is. They just constantly sample and constantly send full bandwidth, so they're always running 100%. It requires a lot of CPU because it's always running 100% and sending everything it sees to the computer. It requires a lot of bandwidth in terms of like USB bus speed or Ethernet bandwidth, and even inside the computer, just CPU and RAM capability to handle it. You could be easily copying tens of gigabytes of data per minute around inside the computer to process it. Another negative is they're rarely a plug and play solution. There's very few things where you can buy an SDR, plug it in, and instantly get something out of it. It's going to take a bunch of effort to get the tooling installed. There are a lot of pre-made tools, but a lot of them are what I call gradware, where grad students wrote them for a degree and published them, and everyone goes, hey, SDR can do this. And then you go and look at it, well, SDR could do that 5 years ago on a piece of hardware you can't afford, and they've never updated the program. So there's some negatives. If you can find dedicated hardware with proper hardware decoder chip in it, like a Wi-Fi radio or whatever, that will always win in terms of ease of use, in terms of power consumption, in terms of CPU load. It will also always win in terms of radio performance. Since it's limited to a single frequency, it gets much less interference, and the radio will perform better than an SDR that's designed to, listen to everything it possibly could. So, where it breaks down, if you can use the real device, the $750 SDR can just about be a $20 Wi-Fi USB card. On the other hand, you can do things with the SDR that you could never do with the Wi-Fi card. So it's worth looking at the hardware. 5 or 10 years ago, there were maybe 1 or 2 SDR manufacturers, and they were a couple of $1,000s each. Now we've got probably 15 different companies out there. This is just a list of a few of them, and they range from, like I said, $25 to $30,000. And what you can do with a $20 one is kind of amazing. So on the cheapest side is the RTL SDR. You can get them on Amazon. They're a little USB stick. They were designed to receive European terrestrial digital TV. And it turns out that you can kick the chip over into a mode that gives you raw radio samples, and it sort of blew the lid off SDR development about 10 years ago, because now suddenly for $25 or $30 you could get into it, and it's really opened up the development to kind of everyone. On the medium scale, there's the Hack RF, the Blade RF, the Lime SDR, the AirSpy. They're all kind of similar devices, and we'll talk a bit more about them towards the end. And if you're looking for, super high-end lab grade, full company support behind it, research quality and whatnot, the Blade RF, and then the USRP is the Universal Software Radio Peripheral, was one of the first SDRs out there. And they have just insane gear at insane prices. So if you have corporate funding and you're doing, corporate RF research, you can look at the USRP. And if you're more on the exploration side of things, you can look at one of the cheaper options. So, what makes the more expensive ones arguably better is that they can tune to wider frequencies. So like the RTL SDR can't see Wi-Fi. It just can't tune up to that frequency. You may not need that. So you may get more fidelity of captured data. So like, again, it can return 8-bit samples or 16-bit or 24-bit, and you can still do a lot with the cheaper things. You might need the more the higher sample rate for some things if you're working on more advanced protocols. A lot of the cheaper ones can't transmit. This isn't necessarily a big deal, because unless you have a ham license and know all the laws in your area, you shouldn't be transmitting anyway. And the more expensive ones also have onboard FPGA to do processing on the board before it offloads it to the computer. So you can use that processing to really speed up the signals, the signal handling before it goes to your computer, so you can handle more high bandwidth things. But it comes at the cost of more expensive hardware, more power consumption, and more expertise needed. So I keep mentioning the RTL SDR. It's dirt cheap. It's still pretty great. It's not a good piece of hardware. It's a $25 piece of junk that's not even meant to do what we're doing with it. But it's fine for everything we're going to talk about in the talk today and tons more on top of that. It also has the advantage where if you've got 4 or 5 protocols you want to look at simultaneously, you need 4 or 5 radios to look at them with. Why spend $400 per radio to do that if you don't need to? So I've got 5 or 6 RTL SDRs plugged into the system at home, looking at a bunch of different protocols because for 20 bucks a piece, I can afford to. It's a great intro into the SDR space. So like I listed some of the negatives before about the SDRs, and it can be really frustrating. So if you want to explore into it and don't want to invest $500 or $600 to find out that it doesn't do what you need it to do and you're not really having a good time with it, then the RTL SDR is a great way to get in and see if it's a useful tool before you invest in something like the HackRF or the BladeRF to do more. So when you're looking at the SDR hardware, what specs are you likely to see? How much you care about the numbers, really, it's like anything else. Do you care if you've got 64 gig of RAM or 32? Well, if you're only using 8 gig of RAM, you don't care. Bigger number means better tool, and better tools means you're a better person. Obviously, not really. So don't get too caught up in the exact specification. Like it's funny to see people get into spec wars about minor revisions of hardware, and in the end, it's like it just whatever gets the job done is all you need. So don't get too concerned. But when you are looking at them, one of the specs you'll see is frequency ranges. So everything happens at a frequency. So measured in hertz, 1,000 hertz is a kilohertz, 1,000 kilohertz is a megahertz, gigahertz, and so on. So for reference, FM radios around 90 megahertz. So like 90.3 FM is 90.3 megahertz. Wi-Fi is at 2,400 megahertz. GPS is around 1,200 megahertz. LTE is around 750, 900, 1,800, depending on your carrier. So most non-licensed gear, so stuff you can buy and operate, like the light switch things, like weather stations, like Wi-Fi, tend to cluster around, they're called ISM bands. They're industrial science and, now I'm blanking, mechanical? Medicine. There we go. Industrial science and medicine, where there are bands pre-allocated, generally worldwide. In the US, they're 433, 900, 2,400, 5,800, and you might recognize a bunch of those numbers from like baby monitors and key fobs and Wi-Fi cards. It's because the restrictions for transmitting in those are much lower, and you can, the gear has to pass the licensing check, but after that, anyone can buy it and run it. So you tend to find a lot of things in those bands. So you also tend to find a lot of SDR hardware that can monitor those bands because people are interested in what's on them. So every SDR will list what ranges it can tune to. It's typically determined by the hardware. So you're not gonna be able to do software to get frequencies you don't have when you buy it. So like the RTL SDR will tune from about 32 megahertz to 2,200 megahertz. The HackRF will tune from essentially 0 to 6 gigahertz. It's got one of the widest ranges out there, and so on. They vary by model. You'll typically get things in the under 100 megahertz to around 6 gigahertz range, which covers almost everything out there now. The other spec that you might care about is the RF bandwidth, which is how much of the frequency can be captured simultaneously by the radio. So basically it means like you can capture 1 megahertz worth of signal. So you could see a protocol that uses a megahertz bandwidth. Wi-Fi, for example, on basic Wi-Fi uses 20 megahertz of bandwidth. So you can't really monitor something that uses more bandwidth than your hardware can capture. Fortunately, again, most of the stuff that cheap radios like the RTL SDR can see in the first place are also using very low bandwidth, so it's a great fit. So the RTL SDR captures 2.5 megahertz. It's a basic device. The HackRF can capture up to 20 megahertz. The BladeRF can do 56. USRP, there are models that can do 80 megahertz, 160 megahertz wide captures. But at that point, you're also looking at a dedicated 10 gig fiber card just to shove data from the radio to your computer, and a computer cluster big enough to process 10 gigasecond constant rate data. The other piece of hardware you'll need is an antenna. So antennas, the performance of the antenna is based on the frequency. So it's a physical relationship with the size of the radio wave and the size of the antenna. So with Wi-Fi, all the antennas are designed to work with Wi-Fi frequencies. They're all essentially interchangeable because it's all Wi-Fi. It's all 2.4 gig and 5.8 gig. For SDR, this isn't true because you might be covering wildly different frequencies. So you're going to have to start considering getting some additional antenna hardware. You know, the bigger the signal, the bigger the antenna. So the antennas that come with most of the RTL SDRs are pure garbage. They're better than nothing, but kind of only barely. I've seen photos of them where they're not even connected on the inside. It's just a wire that goes nowhere. So consider, if you're getting into it, picking up some proper antennas. They're cheap, even on Amazon. Even the crappiest antenna off Amazon's probably just fine. You can get antennas that do variable frequencies, like the old school FM radio antennas that telescope out. The more you extend the antenna, the lower the frequency. Some actually have it marked on the side of the antenna, like how many steps to expand it out to get 400 megahertz or 900 megahertz. So they're pretty handy. You know, they kind of look like that, like you'd expect from an old FM radio. It's also easy to find dedicated antennas for just about any frequency band that you particularly care about. Again, because everything clusters around the same ISM bands, there's a lot of cheap gear for them and a lot of cheap antennas. So there's dedicated 433 megahertz antennas, 900 megahertz, et cetera. There's also a very large ham radio community for antenna resources. For more esoteric things, you can find calculators online for building simple antennas cheaply. It's worth considering when you get more serious into things, but the variable frequency telescope antennas are great to start with. You know, what happens if you get it really wrong and use the wrong antenna? If you're doing receive, you just get a crappy signal. It doesn't matter. You can use a paper clip stuck in the thing and see data just fine. If you're transmitting, it's much more of a problem. Again, you shouldn't be transmitting unless you have a ham license. The FCC frowns on these things. Don't transmit the wrong antenna. In the worst case, you can actually blow out your equipment because the signal bounces around off the wrong sized antenna and burns out the amplifier. But again, if for receive only, it doesn't matter. And remember with antennas, they don't make a signal. Like you don't, they're not amplifiers. They don't add power. They just shape what signal's already out there. So more gain isn't always better because you're getting that, you're shaping the signal by taking it away from somewhere and adding it to somewhere else. So if you're creating a huge amount of gain, maybe you're flattening out your antenna so that you see things far away horizontally, but now you won't see something on the next floor above you in a hotel or in a building. So if you're doing, you know, searching for signals, you actually probably want a lower gain antenna that can see more of a spherical 360-degree view. I just see a lot of people that go crazy buying the biggest antenna they can on Amazon and then wondering why nothing works like they hope it would. Additional hardware that you can add to the SDR are filters. So filters will block parts of the signal and pass other parts. We can filter in software, but that only solves some of the problem. So commercial radios use really strong hardware filters that only pass the small part of the spectrum that they care about through. So they get much better radio performance because they're only ever listening to one tiny slice. Again, since the SDR wants to listen to everything, you don't have that hardware filter. So now you're getting crap from everywhere that's swamping out the signal you want. You can buy cheap external filters that kind of fit in line with the radio off Amazon. And so you can say, I only want 433 megahertz, filter out everything else. And for 15 bucks, you can get a little thing that plugs in line with your antenna and has a hardware filter that cuts everything else out, and you'll get much better performance. But then you'll have to take that off your antenna before you use it to capture anything on any other frequency. So it's all give and take. So the reason we have the filters is there's a problem called aliasing, which is fundamental to the SDR. Since we're taking a frequency and we're trying to read a bunch of data off it and turn it into a digital signal, it comes with some interesting hardware challenges where the radio is converting the signal down to a frequency it can turn into digital internally. And when it does that, it picks, you know, it sort of creates the internal signal and then starts looking at where you're trying to sample from. And signals from the opposite side can show up, no matter, even though they're not where you want them to be. So basically, the end result is that you'll see FM radio everywhere. You might be tuned to 2 gigahertz, you'll see FM radio. 433 megahertz, you'll see FM radio, because they're super strong signals that show up, and the way the SDR samples things, they get mirrored across all the samples. So you buy a hardware filter to exclude FM radio or include only the frequencies you want, and you'll get much better performance when you're actually targeting a specific device. And you'll need one for each band that you're looking at. So if you buy a filter for 400 megahertz, it's going to kill 900 megahertz performance. So if you're looking at, 2 weather stations, one that uses 400 megahertz and one that uses 900, now you're going to need 2 SDRs, 2 filters for the 2 different bands, and so on. Also, when you're buying the antennas, you need to pay attention to the connector. SMA is the most common one. It's the same as the one that's on the Wi-Fi cards. However, most Wi-Fi cards use what's called reverse polarity SMA or RPSMA, where they swap the direction of the pin in the socket internal to the connector. So it looks the same, but then if you look at a regular SMA, it will have a pin inside the same connector that the Wi-Fi antenna has the socket. So don't mix them up, because depending what direction you mix them up in, you'll either have no connection on your antenna, or you'll mash the 2 pins together, bend it, and break your antenna connector. So when you're shopping for antennas, match the one on your SDR hardware. It's almost certainly going to be traditional SMA. Also, lower frequencies go through obstacles better. That's why like 2.4 gig Wi-Fi goes further than 5 gig Wi-Fi. Most SDR is relatively low frequency, so you'll be able to receive it indoors relatively well. If you're in the basement or the bottom of a tall building, it's not going to do you any favors. Having an outdoor antenna might get you much better reception, unless you have obstacles in your way. So if you are going to put an antenna outside, beware of power lines. They will kill you. Beware of lightning. It wants to be your friend. It will come and find you. The number of people I know who've had antennas blown off their roofs by lightning is more than 3. Unless you're ready to set up proper lightning arresters, do not plan to do an outdoor antenna installation. It, best case will fry all your equipment, and worst case will set your house on fire. So, stick an antenna out the window while you're working and then bring it back in, fine. Just be real careful, know where your power lines are. It's one of those things, the number of people who have hit power lines with metal antennas and had a bad time is too many. So when you have the SDR, how are we actually talking to it and getting the data? Most of the cheaper ones are USB 2, USB 3 now. There's some that are direct PCI interfaces. The USRP models tend to be gigabit Ethernet or 10 gigabit Ethernet. I believe they have a model now that's 40 gig Ethernet. If you're buying one of those, you're not in this talk. I'm not buying one of those. There's basically no standards for talking to the SDR. It's just shoving data as fast as possible. The Ethernet ones don't even wrap it in TCP. It's just raw Ethernet frames that you pull off the connection. As far as software tooling goes, the gold standard is GNU Radio. They have been around for decades now, and they are a framework for both capturing and processing data. They have different stages for performing common data manipulation for SDR. MATLAB on the commercial side has a huge data processing framework and interfaces for pulling data direct from software-defined radios. And Liquid SDR is a pure C library for really high-speed signal processing. As far as exploration tools go, so the first thing you'll want to do after you plug it in is go, well, what can I see? And everybody loves pretty graphics when they do that. So the most common tools would be, GQRX for almost every platform. SDR Sharp is the most popular Windows tool for doing this. SDR++ is a new one that works almost everywhere. And Universal Radio Hacker, we'll be talking about much more later on, is a capture and manipulation tool. And they all kind of look the same. You've got GQRX that gives you, your tuning and a nice waterfall of the signal you're seeing. You've got SDR Sharp that gives you tuning in a waterfall of what you're seeing. An SDR++, which gives you your tuning in a waterfall. They're all the same. Pick whatever one runs best for you. They all let you explore around and find signals and log them. And Universal Radio Hacker we'll dive into more soon. Gives you, tuning and capture, but a lot more for once you start exploring the signals. As far as getting them installed, if you're on Linux, Ubuntu, Pentoo all have modern packages for them. Some of the other distributions tend to lag a little bit compared to these two in terms of the latest versions, but you can probably get it working. There's also Dragon OS, which is a custom Linux distribution that is SDR focused, so they tend to have the latest versions of all the radio drivers and all of the tool chains built pre-available to them. It'll run as a live CD or off a USB bootable. On Mac OS, you can download Mac-specific versions, or you can use the Brew homebrew framework to install almost all of them. Windows, you can definitely make it work. It's a bit more of a hassle because Windows does USB weird compared to Linux and Mac. So you have to play around with custom USB drivers to get them to load. But you can certainly do it. Lots of people do. So it really doesn't matter what operating system you prefer. You can use whatever you have to get started on this. So when it comes time to start looking for something you want to monitor, looking for the signals, the first step usually is to research the protocol or the device. There's tons of info on the internet already about most of the protocols out there. And if you're looking at a specific device, at least in the US, everything needs an FCC license. So it either has on the device the frequency that it transmits on, or it has an FCC ID that lets you look up more about it. You can also just scan around to the survey tools, hold your thing next to your antenna, and see if something happens. So if you have an FCC indicator, you'll be able to pull the exact FCC ID off of it. In this case, yeah, so that gives us the actual full licensing ID of the FCC documentation. And there's a great website called fccid.io where you plug that in and it gives you, well, there we go. We now know exactly the frequency range that this thing talks on. And any device that is legal for sale in the US should have this information available. And often you can also find the full manual, the internal photos of the device, things like that. So that's a great resource. So before you go poking around too much, I have to say, know your laws. Know the laws for your country, know the laws for your region, depending on what country you're in. In the US, this is governed by the FCC, but it's also governed by regional case law. So for example, Google screwed up pretty bad, got themselves sued by almost every country in every state, lost the case, and now it is technically illegal to monitor Wi-Fi in, I believe it's District 7 or District 9. That covers Vegas, California, a lot of the west coast of the US, because there's case law that's set in that district that hasn't propagated to the rest because there haven't been cases to mirror it. So know the specifics before you act. It's just a good plan. Transmitting without a license is almost always illegal. Even if it's in an ISM band, there's some wiggle room for research, but find out what the laws are before you do it. Listening can still be illegal on some frequencies in some jurisdictions. In the US, it is illegal to listen to cell phone frequencies, pager frequencies, and a number of other things. Are pagers encrypted? Nope. Can you listen to them? Sure. Is it legal? Nope. So, if you're listening to frequency, can someone tell you're monitoring it? Not really. There's nothing that says that you have a radio tuned to a given frequency unless you talk about it. So, again, if you're going to do something that might be sketchy, don't talk about it in public. Is it still illegal to do it? Yeah, it's still illegal to do it. So, don't. So, things you should never, ever listen to, certainly in the US, possibly in other countries as well. Cell phone frequencies, pager frequencies, especially never transmit on a licensed band like a cell phone band, especially never transmit on a cell phone band, pager band, or GPS band, because spoofing a cell phone in the US is considered terrorism at the federal level for interfering with E911. people get caught up by this because they're dumb and talk about it at HackerCons. Don't do it. You know, it kind of comes down to, you know, some of these things, listening to random frequencies, it comes down to a bit of a moral versus legal question. You know, is it immoral to listen to a random frequency to find out what's going on? I mean, probably not in most cases. Like if I've got a random device in my house and I want to see what it's doing, I don't feel like I'm a bad person for sniffing it and decoding it, but it's still illegal. And if I were to be sniffing and decoding something that happened to be on a cell phone network and then went and talked about it in public, that would be potentially a bad time for me. So, you know, don't do that. And we're only going to talk about things that are completely legit to sniff today. It's just worth putting out there because, you know, every year at some conference, someone does a talk about extracting data from something that's like, oh yeah, no, that was actually illegal what you just talked about in public. So on happier topics, there's a bunch of existing one-shot tools that give us a ton of info from the radio with almost no effort on our part. So you can pull the output from airplanes. It's called ADSB, where it's used for the flight aware network. Like if you look for tracking where your flight is online and whatnot, it all comes from sensors picking up ADSB. AMR is a power meter protocol. There's tools that'll just dump, you know, all the power meter serial numbers near you and their usage rates, so you can, you know, monitor and graph your own power meter at home and draw a nice pretty picture of your power usage. You can see the tire pressure monitors in your car. You can see weather stations, and there's hundreds of other protocols built into a tool called RTL 433. Unsurprisingly, they're all on 433 megahertz, one of those bands that all the crappy unlicensed devices are allowed to be on. So these are all great for pulling existing devices. We'll talk about what to do if you want to go deeper into a protocol, though that isn't covered by one of them. But so, you know, for example, here's ADSB. So plane ABB 972, whoever that was, is in the air. You can see, yeah, at 34,000 feet. I picked that up from inside the hotel down in the developer den. So they're pretty easy to see. You can plot and graph them and see whatever you want. It goes pretty far. I live in mid-state New York. I can see Canada and past Long Island. You know, we mentioned tire pressure monitors. So, you know, someone with a Schrader sensor drove by and can tell you how much tire pressure they have in their car. That's fun. So, you know, we've got stuff that can see see things that are already publicly known, but if we want to start looking for signals, we can look at the, we can use GQRX, those other waterfall tools. We're looking for bursts of transmissions. So we can then look at them and begin to guess what kind of signal is coming out of them. You know, the first thing everyone loves to look at is FM radio because it's loud, it's worldwide. It makes nice noises as opposed to almost every other transmission you're likely to tune to, which will just give you static. So, you know, here's the radio near here. You know, like we said, you know, so here's station 96.5, whatever that is in Kansas City. And you can just see, you know, here's the next band, the next station down and up. Even with an RTL SDR, we can see 4 or 5 FM radio stations simultaneously. There's a little extra fun you can have in FM. So there's the FM waveform in the center where you can see, like, here's the actual audio signal. Since it's analog frequency modulated audio, you can actually see the, you know, the stereo signal bouncing back and forth, and that's like the actual audio spectrogram if you looked at it on a stereo. Then we have these weird shoulder things here where there's these solid bands on either side. So if you ever wondered where the song titles come from or where the traffic reports come from for your car, those are the digital sidebands on the FM radio station. So every couple of radio stations in every city have a digital mode where they send the song titles and complex data, weather data and whatnot for automobiles alongside it. And there you go. You can just see that in GQRX. So let's say we scrolled around with some tool and we found a target. So we say we've got a wireless thermometer. stuck it next to our radio, waited for it to chirp, found something. So now we just get the packets out of it, right? So here's where it gets fun. So almost all the SDRs report the data stream is something called IQ. So that stands, it stands for real and imaginary components of a number. So step one is we have math dealing with imaginary numbers. Great. Essentially what they do is they form overlapping sine waves with different amplitudes and phases and frequencies. Diving into the internals of IQ would be essentially a week-long class all on its own. But basically, it's a data format that gives us the ability to translate it to amplitude or frequency or phase of the signal. So we're able to get more data out of it than just how loud it was. We're able to find out, you know, it's a sine wave with a phase of some amount, which is required for decoding most more complex protocols. So the radio gives it to us, and we have, you know, the sampling rates, and it comes down to how many IQ samples per second the radio is delivering to us. It's kind of like audio fidelity. If you have, you know, 11K audio, it's kind of scratchy and crappy, and if you have 128 kilobit audio, it sounds, you know, really good CD quality. Similarly, if you have really low fidelity sampling rates, then your signal that you're getting is going to be harder to decode. So if it's a slow protocol or a loud protocol, that might be fine. If it's a much more complex protocol, you may need to have, you know, the maximum sampling rate out there. You know, what sampling rate do you need? It depends. You need at least twice the samples as the speed that the signal transitions between states. So by that we mean, you know, it's called the Nyquist rate, because some dude Nyquist came up with this theory. Imagine that. So if you have a signal that's transmitting at 1 megabit, to read that with an SDR, you need at least 2 megabit to sample it. The more samples you can take, the higher the fidelity of the signal you're receiving. But the more samples you take, the more CPU you need to process them, the more RAM you need to hold them, the more bandwidth you need to transfer them over USB or Ethernet or whatever, the more storage you need to record them. So you really have to kind of find that balance between it's enough to understand the protocol and not so much that it swamps out my hardware. So why can't we just sample the rate we need? Well, because you know, if the beat of the sample matches, then you're always going to get your data. But if you're one off, you're never going to see that signal at all. And you don't know if you're just missing the signal every time or if there's no signal. So, you know, if we had a signal that was on, off, on, off, on, off, and we were exactly missing it by 1, we would never read anything. It's always a 0 on that signal. Whereas if we sampled at twice the rate, now we know the thinner line here is always going to intercept the signal line at some point. So that gives us enough to know that we're actually capturing each transition of the signal. And if we were sampling it at 10 times the rate, then, you know, we're getting more data than we need, but we're absolutely sure that we're getting the exact length of each signal because we're oversampling. So, you know, how do you pick that sample rate? Well, it depends. Most of the SDRs have a set of sample rates that they will return to you. You don't get to pick arbitrarily random ones. So basically, you're just going to end up picking the nearest one that's at least twice your signal and figuring out the rest with math. So, you know, we're getting samples now. So what are we getting? Well, the OSI layer model, you can kind of forget it in terms of SDR. We're almost exclusively going to be talking about layer 1 PHY layer. A lot of these protocols don't even have any concept of media access. Some of them don't even have unique identifiers per device. So there's no MAC addresses, there's no retransmission. It is, you know, a weather station is a transmit-only device that's going to wake up every 30 seconds, blast out its weather data 10 times, and hope something on the other end saw one of them. There's no retries, there's no collision detection, there's no unique identifiers. So digging into, you know, this weird layer 1, we're going to have to define some terms again. Oh no, we're starting with defining bits. So a bit is a 0 or 1. Surprise. Unfortunately, that's not all. So if we're talking about signal analysis and SDR capture, we have both the bit in the air. So we got, you know, the encoding has a 1 or a 0, but that doesn't mean it's 1 or a 0 in the protocol. It just means that it's a state transition in the air, but you might need multiple bits to encode 1 bit of data in reality, which we will get to. So in terms of encoding a bit in the air, there's a couple of options. You know, there's plenty of other encoding out there, but the ones you're most likely to see, so there's on-off keying, OK, which is like Morse code, where it's just, there's a transmission, there's not a transmission. There's a transmission, there's not a transmission. There's amplitude keying, where there's a quiet transmission, there's a loud transmission, there's a quiet transmission. And so a 0 is quiet and a 1 is loud, or a 0 is loud and a 1 is quiet. More difficultly, there's frequency shifting, where it's, you know, a 0 is on 400 megahertz and a 1 is on 400.1 megahertz, and it just toggles back and forth which frequency it's transmitting on for that. There's phase shift keying, where it alters the phase of the sine wave of the signal. And then there's the black magic, good luck if you don't have a PhD signals, used for things like Wi-Fi and cable modems and whatnot, so like QAM, OFDM, etc. So if we're looking at some of these things in GQRX, so here's a device that uses OOK. So you can see it, the device wakes up and then it starts going on, off, and you can actually see each bit that it's sending. Similarly, here's a device talking in FSK. So it's, you know, here's the lower frequency is one state and the higher frequency is the other, and it wakes up and it toggles back and forth between them really quick, and then it goes back quietly. So before we looked at FM radio, so this is different than FM radio, because since FM radio is essentially analog, it's spreading the signal of the analog audio across the whole bandwidth. Whereas with FSK, it's digital. So it's waking up for a brief amount of time. When it's quiet, there's no transmission at all, and it's just toggling between 2 fixed frequencies instead of spreading across an analog swath. Yeah. So the comment was, you know, bit versus baud. Yeah. I've seen baud used too many different ways to try to use it on this today. But yeah, so there's the logical bit inside the protocol, and then there's the radio bit in terms of what's sent internally. And for every encoding, there are a lot of variants. You know, they can use different amounts of bandwidth to encode more or less data at a time. They can use different data rates, so how fast it transitions between the 2 states. But it's all sort of the same basic schemes, and once you start looking at them, you'll start seeing a lot more patterns and more devices using the same schemes. There's also mixed variants, where you could have a protocol that does both amplitude keying, where it's loud and quiet, and frequency keying, where now you have 4 states that it can transmit in one cycle, where it could be loud on the lower frequency, or loud on the higher frequency, or quiet on the lower frequency. So the more advanced radio protocols are just stacking more and more of the encoding types together to try to cram more data into one cycle of transmission. So we're talking about, you know, bits on the air versus bits in the protocol. So when we're talking about what's being sent at the radio layer, we need to think about symbols. So a symbol can encode 1 or sometimes more than 1 bit in a communication. So if you wanted to send 1 bit of data in, like, say, a Wi-Fi frame, you might need to actually transmit 4 bits of data to indicate what the actual content is. We need to do that because, you know, the transmission encoding, you know, frequency shifting, amplitude shifting, whatnot, tells us how to differentiate between the 2 states of the radio. But how do we know what makes up a single bit in the air? We don't know if we saw the beginning of the bit being transmitted. We don't know if we've seen the entire transmission. We don't have any sort of synchronization with the transmitter. So, you know, say we get a signal that comes out as, you know, 1111. Well, is that 4 ones? is that 2 ones and we were sampling too slow and stretch or too fast and stretch them out to think that they're 4? Say we get 3 ones. Is that 3 ones? Is it 2 and we started reading too quickly? Is it 4 and we missed part of the transmission? So there's encoding methods that'll help solve this. It requires that we transmit more bits over the air to make up one logical bit of data that we care about, because we need to ensure that we're communicating clearly what the actual state is. There's lots of ways to solve this. There's many options. We're going to talk about the Manchester encoding because it's one of the more popular ones. It's used by nearly every cheap device out there that you'll encounter. Basically, it just says that for every bit, there's going to be two states sent. So if you're sending a 0, you're always going to send a low and then a high. If you're sending a 1, you're always going to send a high and a low. So if you're sending 4 ones, you'd be sending high, low, high, low, high, low, high, low. So it's not ambiguous anymore. Now we know. If we see a high transition to a low transition, we know that it's a 1. If we see a low transition to a high, we know it's a 0. And if we see 2 lows, we know it doesn't mean anything. So we're less ambiguous, but now it takes us twice as long to send the data, because now we're having to do 2 transitions for every 1 bit of data. So, with Manchester here, if we had 1 0 1 0 0, then it would always be high low, low high, and so on. This is as a little sidebar. If you ever wondered why you only get about a third the speed claimed on Wi-Fi, because you ever got a 300 megabit link, enjoy your 90 megabit of traffic. This is part of why, because the marketing likes to brag about the rate of bits in the air, not the rate of bits of protocol it can send over them. So after you deal with all of the encoding and things like that, all of a sudden you've got about a third the actual bandwidth you think you have. So you mentioned frequency. So that's where in the spectrum that it lives. Basic Wi-Fi is at 2.4 gig, 2400 megahertz. The bandwidth of the signal is how much of the frequency it uses. So it could be centered at 2400, but used 20 megahertz. So it'd be on either side. Embedded sensors, like most of what we're looking at, tend to use bandwidth in the kilohertz range rather than the megahertz range. They're very small, cheap, battery powered, don't use a lot of power, don't have a lot of capability. The other thing we'll be looking at a bunch is the preamble. So it's present in most protocols, including Ethernet on the wire. Wi-Fi, you just never see it. So the preamble just basically means, hey, wake up, I'm about to send a packet. So it lets the receiver identify that the packet's incoming and synchronize the start of the packet. Usually it's just sending 10 10 10. So if we later on we're looking at this in hex, we'll start seeing things that repeat multiple times as like AAAA, 5555. They're all 10 10 10. So most of the time, decoding a protocol will be spent doing filtering and demodulation. This gets into the nitty-gritty of digital signal processing, the internals of some of the SDR stuff. So here's where it gets fun. So basically, the filter lets you take a noisy signal and turn it into a less noisy signal. So you can filter out high frequency noise, low frequency noise. You can just average the signal and see if it turns into something. And we can explore all of these with URH, Universal Radio Hacker, which was the 4th option earlier that didn't have all the pretty graphics. So we'll use GQRX and friends for finding the frequency, but URH for capturing and decoding. It runs on pretty much everything. It'll run on Mac, Windows, Linux. It's great. You can capture directly in it and then use it to process the signal and start pulling data out of it. So you record a signal. In this case, we pick a frequency that's kind of where we were hoping to find one before. We mentioned 433. You get the graph here that kind of shows that something's going on. Okay, so we know we've captured something useful. And then we zoom in on it in GQRX. It certainly looks like something. Like it's not just noise, at least. It's some form of transmission. And here's where URH is absolutely amazing. You can just select the signal in the graph, crop to selection, and then hit a button that says, figure it out, go make a guess, auto detect. And here we go. Just by selecting it and hitting auto detect, it's already figured out that it thinks it's FSK, so frequency shifting. It thinks it's getting 10 samples a second. And, it still kind of looks like a pile of garbage, but we can keep digging into it more. So it can do basic ASK, OK, FSK, skip through them. Most embedded devices are going to use one of those. And if you switch to what they call DMOD view, now all of a sudden, that actually looks like something that's doing transitions, like the Manchester graph we had before, where it was, high, low, alternating. So seeing these groupings of, alternating signals with the longer bands in them is very promising. So then if we apply the filter in URH, this is just all in the basic UI, suddenly it's much more clean looking, and we can see what actually looks like a digital transmission now. And all of this came out of that pile of noise we recorded that just looked like a random blurb. So we know the encoding type, we know the data rates. We can just read the data, right? Well, again, some radios randomize how the data is encoded. There's no reason text is ASCII. There's no reason that integers are 8 bits. You'd hope they are, but they're not. These devices are usually transmitted from super tiny embedded devices, so they're not going to waste space on 8 bits when they have a sample that fits in 5. Sometimes they're optimized for other reasons or legacy reasons where they have to talk to older legacy hardware. So for an example, the airplane protocol, ADSB, transmits its altitude as 13 bits measured in feet. Those 13 bits aren't together. It's not 13 bits contiguous. It's like 7 bits and 6 bits with a gap in the middle, because why? They also have another altitude protocol. Another altitude transmission in the same protocol. It's 12 bits, not contiguous, in feet, multiplied by 25, and then subtract 1,000. So it's really hard to like look at the protocol in URH and then go, oh, I recognize that. That's feet. That's 35,000. That makes sense. No. Gerald asks if they're trying to convert feet to Celsius. I like that. I do not know why it's that way. It may have had to match an older protocol on another device, or it may just be that they're crazy. Also, they again, ADSB encodes the flight number. The alphabet is not ASCII. It's not contiguous. It's not a full character set. It really helps to have external knowledge of the protocols before you start digging into them. This sucks if you're trying to figure out something that no one else has worked on. It's great if you're trying to figure out, something that there's a little bit of info out there about already. So, we've done some exploring with URH. We have a protocol. We've done a little digging into it. We can export it, but that's not really good for long-term processing. You can't like set up URH and use it to capture thermometers around your house all day and give you a graph. So, how do we turn this into a tool that we can actually integrate with other things? So, we've got GNU Radio Companion. It's basically Lego modules that let us put together a decode. It's good for deeper exploration. Again, it's not exactly great for automatic tooling. You can kind of snap together all the different, filters and decoding methods and whatnot. But we also have Python. Python's great. Python can talk to almost anything. So you can talk directly to the radio drivers in Python. NumPy and SciPy give us high-speed numerical and scientific algorithms that we can use to do the DSP. Yeah. If you love doing this, any military would love you to join them and work in SIGINT. That may be true. So there's also C++. It's harder to manipulate arbitrary byte streams. There's some great libraries for DSP and C++ as well, but it's not a friendly introduction. Most of GNU Radio is C++ under the covers. There's lots of resources there, but we'll stick with Python because it's the most readable. So there's NumPy, which is a high-speed processing library. We'll use it very heavily. This is still only the 1,000-foot view of it to sort of give an idea of what's possible and maybe hopefully give some things that you can research more into and dig into and find some of the open source implementations for the exact details, because it's really hard to communicate math and Python in an hour. It helps to remember some basic Pythonisms if you don't use Python often. Python slices and iterators are hugely helpful here. Basically, you can take an array and slice it by the start and the end, or you can skip a number of bytes at a time. So you'll see us using the skip a lot in the example code. And we use NumPy whenever possible for speed because it implements all the math functions with a native library instead of in the Python interpreter. So, our basic steps are going to be, acquire data, convert the IQ data from an imaginary number to something that makes any sort of sense that we can use, apply filters to it, turn them into bits, look for that preamble of 010101, and then turn those bits into our data. As far as acquiring the data goes, you've got, librtlsdr is a library that talks directly to the RTLSDR USB device. It exists on any platform. There's a library called SOAPy, which is meant to be a multi-hardware library with a common interface. You can use SOAPy to talk to HackRF, BladeRF, RTLSDR, etc. You can read the saved files from other tools, like you can just export your data from GQRX or URH and read it in as a file, so you don't even need a radio to work on this once you have the captures. Python and the foreign function interface in Python let us talk directly to the USB drivers with minimal pain, so you can just open librtlsdr and use the C API to pull packets out of it. No matter how we end up with that data, we're basically getting that stream of IQ data, the real and imaginary numbers. So usually we need to convert the imaginary into real. How you do that depends on the encoding. If you care about frequency, you do it one way. If you care about the power of the signal, the amplitude, you do it a different way. So just as an example, one of the things you do is you add the squares of the real and the imaginary numbers to get the amplitude. And there's tricks to do that more quickly. So in this case, in Python, we're just doing make a new buffer where we're using that iterator operator on the arrays again. So we can go every other even sample added to the square of every other odd sample. So we start by 1 and skip by 2, or start by 0 and skip by 2. And that gets us the amplitude where we've added the square of each sample together. And now instead of an imaginary number, we have the signal level number. So we can start doing things with that. In this case, we pre-computed every possible square number from 0 to 256 because it's quicker to do that once and then reference the array than to compute them every sample when you're getting 2 million samples per second in Python. So then we need to take those analog signals where we have a number that's basically -128 to +128 if it's 8-bit. We need to figure out how to extract the digital signal from that. So we can just say, okay, anything greater than 50% is on and anything less than 50% is off. So that would make sense. So if we had a theoretical signal of on, off, on, off, on, off, we went, okay, everything greater than 0 is on and everything less is off. And we get the nice little red line there that turns into, okay, we got bits that perfectly matched our signal. That's great. That's a good representation. Unfortunately, in reality, the signal is probably going to look more like that. So if we apply the same logic to that, suddenly we don't get nice 1s and 0s in the slightest. So why is it so bad? Well, reality is noisy. If you have not the greatest antenna, it can effectively round off the edges of the signal. So instead of a nice digital transition, you get the weird wobbly edges and noise. You just get noise in the air, white noise from the universe, cosmic, whatever background noise. Other signals, the transmit hardware is usually crappy. I mean, you paid $20 for this wireless thermometer, and yeah, it's got a 2-cent transmitter. You can get other signals overlapping. We mentioned the alias problem where you might get like FM radio in the middle of your signal because SDR hardware works that way. So we need to account for all of those. It's like you might get another signal right in the middle of your packet. So we've got a nice clear packet here. Oh, wait. Hey there, buddy. What's that? What's that? That's some other high-speed transmission right in the middle of our low-speed transmission we're looking at. And it's just there. You might get wildly different signal levels. So if you're just doing basic comparison of signal levels, you might miss quiet packets. So in here, we've actually got a really quiet packet there and a really loud packet there. And then again, these are actually from, so this is my power meter. That's my neighbor's power meter. But we care about both those signals. So we need to come up with ways that we can filter the data and normalize it so that we can still extract, useful data despite huge variances in the incoming signal. So, we want to turn the wobbly, fuzzy analog data into more readable trend-based data. We want to wipe out the noise as best we can. So we're back to looking at filters. There's as many filter variants as you could possibly imagine. Most of them are named after people with PhDs or multiple PhDs. Welcome to the fun of DSP. One of the simplest ones, and it's still really effective, is the moving average. We'll look at some other examples of that one, and I've got some links at the end for some free books on filtering. Again, in Python, we can just do this with just 3 lines of Python, which we'll actually go into in a moment. But this does a moving average filter of the signal. So basically, we say, using NumPy, do a cumulative sum of the data. So it's basically kind of like the Fibonacci sequence, where each element, it just adds to the previous one and turns that into a new stream. So if we fed it, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, we'd get 0, 1, 3, 6, 10 out of it. But then we slice the first and last windows, which we'll talk about soon, off of the data, and then average it. So for each chunk of the signal, we return the average. So now if we take our noisy signal, and this is just applying that moving average to it, we now get a nice, up and down pattern that matches the signal despite all of the corruption and noise in it. So if we do that same transition before, where we went, if you're above 0, you're a 1, and if you're below 0, you're 0, then that same noisy signal that was complete garbage before, we now get a nice, predictable signal back out of it. So just with a simple 3-line filter, we're able to take absolute crap and get back to the original signal. And then the next thing you typically do is it's called decimating the signal, where you're reducing the number of samples. So we were oversampling because of Nyquist, and because, say the radio can only sample at 2.4 million samples, and we only need 1 million. Well, now we've got 1.4 as much data as we need. So it's called decimation. No, it's not 10%. The Romans would be sad. So again, we just do the Python slice operation, where we just go, okay, skip every 10th sample, or 24, etc. And then, well, we need to find that preamble, the pattern of 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1 that begins the packet. So we could either do a naive search, where we just go, okay, starting at array 0, are the next 5 1s, 0, 1, 0, 1? No. Starting at 1, or the next, no. It's possible, it'll work. It'll take forever in Python, and you'll have a really hard time keeping up with the protocol. We could also use some functions built into NumPy, which is why NumPy is great, which will do it'll look for a likely match, and then let us do the exact matches for those hits. So for example, if we had a preamble of 10, 10, 10, 10, blah, 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 NumPy correlate the buffer that we pulled out with the average filter in that preamble, and then return the most likely match. And this is just going to tell us where in that buffer it thinks 10, 10, 10, 10 is. And it does a pretty good job being slightly fuzzy about it. Like you could have a double bit or something, you'll still find the preamble. It's great. So So then we have, the stream of bits from the radio. We think we have the start of the packet. Now we go back to when we talked about Manchester encoding, for example, where we need to turn a bunch of transitions in the radio into a single bit of data. Again, hard to make it interesting, but you can do Manchester in Python in 5 lines where it's just, what was the previous state? What's the next state? Return a 0 or a 1. And then finally, almost every packet out there is going to have a checksum, even the crappy little embedded ones. Radio transmission is a garbage fire. It's nothing but corrupted junk data. So you need to validate the checksum to see if what you received and decoded makes any sense. There's a bunch of brute force checksum tools available online. If you just search for like checksum calculator, where you can put in the checksum value and the data, and it'll try to tell you what it thinks the algorithm is, what the seed values are, and then just gives you a little dump of it. If you're feeling really spicy and it's a simple protocol, you can try to autocorrect missing bits and rechecksum it. So some of the more advanced ADSB tools will brute force the checksum until they get a valid packet from a corrupted one. And finally, after all of this, we'll have a stream of bytes we think is our packet. Now, what went into that packet? Well, now that'll be your fun to figure out what's actually in there. Just remember, words might not be 8 bits or 16 bits. Text might not be ASCII. For an example of that, here's the layout of power meter packets, where it's 24-bit identifiers and a 24-bit meter value. But so let's say we figured all that out. What do we do now? We can celebrate our victory, dump that data somewhere we can use it. So if it's a protocol that has a DLT, you can just write it to a PCAP, open it in Wireshark, and there you go. Otherwise, you may need to, campaign and request a DLT for it and write a dissector in Wireshark that handles it. Or you can do custom decoders. You can put it in a UDP packet and have a Lua script in Wireshark that reads the data out and displays it all for you. Tools like Kismet kind of talk arbitrary content without caring so much about what the link type was under the covers. A lot of tools let you dump it as JSON. So like RTL 433 will dump it as a JSON record, and you can pipe that right into MQTT and receive that on systems to graph it and whatnot. And moving on beyond that, like some of the super advanced SDR stuff, there's FPGA enabled SDRs, like we said. So the Blade RF, the USRP, some others. Basically, if you can implement the full decode in the FPGA, you offload all the work. It's still power hungry, it's still expensive, and now you've taken the rare skill set of DSP and signal analysis and the skill set of FPGA and went, I need them both for my project. That's not going to work. But for some great examples, so the Blade RF team has implemented full 802.11n implemented in the FPGA. It's a public license. You can go download the HDL design files for the FPGA. I think you still need a 25 gig compiler just to build it, but the beauty of it is now there's an SDR-based Wi-Fi card that can sniff and inject anything that acts even slightly like a Wi-Fi frame with no interference from the firmware and exact timing without having to deal with waiting for the kernel transmitter or USB latency or anything. So that's pretty cool. And since it's in the FPGA, you can actually do all that from a Raspberry Pi because it doesn't need any of the host processing. All of the stuff we just discussed with the filtering, the transforms, and the translation and the symbols are all handled in the programmable chip on the radio. They also have a ADSB implementation that can, in parallel, try thousands of bit flips to fix a corrupted packet. We also didn't cover transmission at all because, again, probably illegal. It's the same, just do it the other way. You basically have to take the waveform you want and create a binary stream from it instead of creating a binary stream from the waveform. URH has a built-in automated transmission thing built part of it. That's not something we're going to have any time to cover today, since I think I'm already basically at question time. And again, transmission requires licensing, so don't. There's also things I call SDR-like objects. So there's the Yardstick one, the Ubertooth, RFCat. There's others that may have heard of. So they're usually built on a flexible chip, usually the TICC family. So it's a microcontroller and a radio, and it's meant for cheap, crappy IoT devices, weather stations, that kind of thing. I'll use this chip internally. So it's got a handful of encodings built into it. And so you can, if you're talking a protocol that's one of the few handled by this chip, then you can just get this chip, use something like RFCAT, and talk to it directly, transmit, receive, but only on those protocols. You can't get the raw radio samples. You can't do any other type of encoding. You can't do any other speeds than what it supports. It's still really cool. Sometimes you'll get lucky. Often you won't get lucky. Even if you do get lucky, you'll probably need an SDR to find the signal you're looking for in the first place, identify it, use URH to measure the encoding type and the rates, so you know what to plug into this little chip. So the SDR, Universal Radio Hacker, still have a huge role, even if you're looking at a protocol that's already handled by one of these dedicated chips. But they could be an interesting way to make a receiver without having the processing power. And then some resources. So Universal Radio Hacker is hosted on GitHub. Kismet has a bunch of SDR tools in it now, which are on GitHub. On YouTube, there's a series by Mike Osman, who designed the HackRF. It's called SDR with HackRF. It applies to many other things, though, where he does I think it's a 12-part course that's almost entirely on IQ sampling. RTLSDR.com. And then DSPguide.com is a free book. I think it's 26 chapters. You can download PDFs of each chapter that are all the mathematics behind filtering and transforms. So building the moving average filter and whatnot came from that book. And then we got there. If there's any questions or any questions from the So for the online chat, the question was if anyone in the room was a ham operator, and one person is. Oh, two, 3. People didn't raise their hands, or I didn't see them. But yeah, there we go. Oh. Yeah, so the question was, what's the first steps if you get an RTL SDR? I would probably install GQRX, and that'll give you like just a quick glance around and look at where things are, and then Universal Radio Hacker to once you find something you want to capture, yeah, and buy a better antenna. Depending which one you got, like if you got one like RTL SDR blog makes a branded one, and they have a good antenna. But like if you get the ones that have the little crappy magnetic antenna on a wire, they're not good. Yeah, yeah. Some of the ham radio tower home towers are crazy. Yeah, so the question was, are IoT devices a good place to start since the protocols are pretty understood? Yeah, I think so. There's also sort of the slightly dumber IoT class of things. So like you can buy on Amazon a 4-pack of thermometers and a little LCD display, and you can stick them around your house and it shows up in your living room. Those are a great thing to start on as well, because RTL 433 can sniff them to begin with. So that gives you sort of a well-known protocol implementation, and then you can go from there and figure out, you can sort of reverse figure out the same data yourself. And now you can apply those techniques to more. ADSB is another great one to work on, the airplane one, because you can see it almost everywhere and it's well understood. So you can write decoders for that yourself and work on it that way. Car key fobs, you're not going to necessarily pull useful data out of them because they should be a randomized rolling number. Honda didn't, but there you go. But you can at least look at them as an easy way to see a signal.